She did not go looking for the other woman. She went looking for a leak in the books, because Verity had learned a long time ago that men could lie to your face, but numbers never once learned how. 9 days before the wedding that would bind the Voss name to the Renards forever, the man whose child she was quietly carrying began slipping out of the house after midnight. When she finally found the door he had been hiding behind, the warm smell of clean linen and iron drops for expectant mothers stopped her cold on the landing. What she saw through the narrow gap in those curtains did not simply end the life she had planned. It made her run before he could open his mouth to explain. The rain had been falling on Farron Hill for 3 days without once losing its patience, and Verity had counted every hour of it from the window seat in the north study. She was not supposed to be counting anything that night except guest confirmations and the cost of imported lilies, but her mind kept drifting to the small, hard fact she had been carrying against her ribs for 11 days. Now a fact no larger than a lentil and heavier than the entire house. She pressed her palm flat against the low curve of her stomach, where nothing showed yet, where nothing would show for weeks, and she breathed slowly until the panic loosened its grip on her throat. On the desk in front of her lay the wedding. Not the marriage, she reminded herself. The wedding, the event, 600 chairs, a string quartet flown in from the capital, a cake taller than the priest. Coralie Renard wanted white roses, with the thorns stripped by hand, and she had said so in a voice that suggested the thorns were a personal insult she had suffered before. Verity had written it all down in her small, even hand, because writing it down was her job, and because if she stopped writing, she would have to think about the fact that she was planning the wedding of the man she loved to another woman while his child grew silently inside her. She was good at her job. That was the cruel part. In the 7 years she had worked for the Voss family, she had made herself indispensable in the quietest possible way, the way water makes itself indispensable, by being everywhere and drawing no attention to itself. She kept the clean books and the dirty ones, and she was the only living person who knew which numbers in the ledgers were real and which were beautiful fiction. When the accountants from the north came to inspect the shipping accounts, it was Verity who walked them through a version of the truth so smooth they never felt the seams. She knew where every dollar slept. She knew which harbor inspectors took cash and which took favors, and which took nothing at all and had to be worked around. She was the memory of the empire, and an empire does not fall in love with its own memory. Lazar Voss did not know about the baby. That was the arrangement she had made with herself, sitting on the cold tile of her bathroom floor 11 nights ago, with the little test resting on her knee like a verdict. She would tell him after the wedding. She would find some clean, quiet moment on the far side of the alliance, when the Renards were bound to the family by paper and blood, and there was no longer any reason for him to marry a woman he did not love. She had it all planned out, the way she planned everything, in careful stages, with margins for error. She had not left any margin for the possibility that she was wrong about him. She had never once, in 7 years, been wrong about him. There had been a night, only a month before, when she had almost told him anyway. They had been in her rooms in the small hours, and he had fallen asleep with his hands spread open on her stomach as though he already knew, as though some animal part of him had counted what her mind had not yet dared to, and she had lain awake staring at the ceiling with the words gathered in her throat like water behind a wall. Lazar, there is going to be a child. She had held them there until dawn, and then she had let them go, because the alliance was moving, because Silas Renard did not tolerate loose ends, and a secret child was the loosest end of all. Because she had convinced herself that the kindest and safest thing she could do for the small, hard fact against her ribs was to keep it hers alone until the danger passed. She had thought she was protecting them. That was the joke of it, the joke she would turn over and over in the days to come. She had been so busy protecting her secret from him that it had never once occurred to her to wonder what secret he was protecting from her. She had come to love him. Slowly. The way you come to love a language you were forced to learn. In the beginning he had frightened her as he frightened everyone, with the stillness of him, the way he could sit across a table from a man who had stolen from the family and simply wait, saying nothing, until the man confessed out of pure terror of the silence. But she had also seen the other things. She had seen him carry an old dock worker to the hospital himself, when the man collapsed loading crates, and stay through the night, and pay the bills under a false name so no one would call it charity. She had seen how he pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his own wrist when he was thinking, feeling for his own pulse, as though he needed to reassure himself he was still a living man, and not the machine everyone believed him to be. She knew that gesture better than she knew her own reflection. She had watched him make it 1,000 times across 1,000 meetings, and 4 months ago in the wine cellar, during a party neither of them wanted to attend. She had reached out and pressed her fingers to his wrist instead, and felt his pulse jump, and that had been the beginning of everything. They had told no one. There had been nothing to tell, at first. And then there had been far too much. And by the time it mattered, the alliance with the Renards was already moving like a tide, and you do not tell the tide to stop. Silas Renard controlled the entire northern coast, every port from the bay to the border, and the Voss family needed those ports the way a man needs a second lung. The old men of both families had drawn up the alliance in a single afternoon over a bottle of something expensive, and they had sealed it with the 2 youngest pieces on the board, Lazar and Coralie, the way old men always do. Lazar had agreed to it in front of everyone, with a single nod, and Verity had watched from her place against the wall, and she had understood, in the way she understood numbers, exactly what it would cost, and exactly who would pay. Coralie Renard had come to the house that very afternoon, before the rain turned to the kind that kept a woman up at the window. She arrived the way weather arrives, without knocking, trailing 2 silent men of her father's, and a scent of something white and expensive that made Verity think of hospitals. She was beautiful the way a bank is beautiful, all cold marble and good bones, and the quiet certainty that everything inside her belonged to someone. She sat in the good chair in the morning room, and let a seamstress pin the hem of a dress that cost more than the cannery house. And she did not once look at the seamstress kneeling at her feet, and she did not once look at Verity either, except as a person looks at a well-made piece of furniture, to confirm it is where it should be. "You are the one who arranges things," Coralie said at last, to the window rather than to Verity. "My mother says you are very good. She says the Voss family would fall down without you." She turned her head then slowly, and looked at Verity with pale eyes that gave away nothing at all. "Is that true?" "I keep the calendar," Verity said. "I would not want to take credit for holding up a whole family." Coralie smiled, without any part of her face agreeing to it. "That is a careful answer," she said. "My father likes careful people. He says you can trust a careful person to protect a secret, right up until the moment the secret becomes more expensive than the trust." She lifted her arm so the seamstress could reach the seam beneath it, and she watched Verity, the whole time she did it. "Do you have any secrets?" she asked, in the light bored voice of a woman asking about the weather. Verity felt the small, hard fact turn over against her ribs, and she kept her face as smooth as still water and said, "Only the seating chart, and the florist is threatening to make it a scandal." That earned a real flicker of amusement, brief as a struck match. Coralie let her arm down. "When we are married," she said, "there will be changes. My father does not care for how loosely this house holds its people. He says a family that keeps too many trusted servants is a family with too many doors." She said the word servants, the way you set down something you did not want to hold. She let it sit in the room. Then she added, almost kindly, "I am sure you understand. A woman in your position learns quickly which doors are hers." Verity understood. She understood, exactly. She was being told, in the polished language the northern families used for their threats, that the day the paper was signed, her usefulness would begin its slow conversion into a liability, and that Silas Renard was a man who closed doors and did not reopen them, and that Coralie already knew, or suspected, or had been sent to suggest, that she knew, that this house was full of things kept behind curtains. Verity smiled, and offered her more tea, and thought, with the cold, clear part of her mind that never slept, that Coralie Renard had not come to try on a dress. She had come to take the measure of the room she was about to inherit, and to let the furniture know it had been counted. So she planned the wedding, and she said nothing, and she counted the rain. It was past midnight when she heard the side door. She knew every sound the house made. She knew the groan of the third stair, and the particular sigh of the kitchen door, and the way the old radiator in the east hall knocked twice before it settled. The side door off the garden was a sound she was not supposed to hear at this hour, because the side door off the garden was the door men used when they did not want to be seen using a door. She rose from the window seat, one hand still resting against her stomach out of a habit only 11 days old, and she moved to the study door and opened it a careful inch. Lazar crossed the dark hall below her in his long black coat. He was not walking like a man going to a meeting. She knew all his walks, and this was not the slow, deliberate stride he used when he wanted to be watched, nor the quick, clipped one he used when something had gone wrong at the docks. This was quiet. This was a man trying not to wake a house. He had a paper bag in one hand, the kind you carried out of a pharmacy, folded down neatly at the top, and he held it against his chest the way you hold something you do not want to drop. Behind him, at the door, waited Emrys. Emrys had driven for Lazar since before Verity came to the family. A lean, quiet man, with a face like a closed fist, loyal in a way that had nothing to do with money. If Emrys was taking Lazar somewhere after midnight with a folded pharmacy bag and no other guards, then wherever they were going was a secret even from the men who guarded the secrets. Verity stood very still in the gap of the door and watched them go, and she felt the first cold thread of something she did not have a name for yet pull tight in her chest. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a great many reasonable things as she went back to the window seat and picked up the seating chart and tried to care whether the Renard cousins were placed near the string quartet. But her mind was already doing the thing it did. The thing she could not switch off, the thing that made her good at her job and bad at peace. It was counting. It was noticing. It was laying one small fact beside another and refusing to look away until they made a shape. The pharmacy bag was the first fact. The second fact she found the next morning, and it was worse, because the second fact was in the books. She kept the household accounts in a leather ledger that never left the locked drawer of her own desk, and she reconciled them every Tuesday with the patience of a woman diffusing something. That Tuesday, 3 days after the rain finally stopped, she found a discrepancy in the grocery orders. It was small. It was the kind of thing no one else in the world would ever have caught. A few $100s a week, routed through the kitchen accounts to a delivery address she did not recognize, tucked between the fish orders and the wine. Someone had been buying food and having it sent somewhere that was not the house, and the someone had been clever about it, clever enough to bury it in the one set of books they assumed she trusted without reading. But there was no set of books Verity trusted without reading. There never had been. She sat very still at her desk with the ledger open and her pen resting in the crease, and she read the address 3 times. It meant nothing to her. It was in the old cannery district down by the flats, a part of the city the family had abandoned years ago, a place of shut factories and streets the lamplighters had given up on. There was nothing down there worth guarding, and nothing down there worth hiding. Unless you wanted to hide something no one would think to look for. She should have closed the ledger. She was aware, even then, of a small, clear voice telling her to close the ledger and let the number lie just this once, just this one time in her entire careful life. but she had built her whole self on the promise that she would never let a number lie, and she was not able to unbuild it now, not even to protect herself. Not even when some animal part of her had already guessed what she would find. The delivery orders included fresh fruit, ginger tea, soft bread, and, once folded into the total so neatly she almost missed it, a standing weekly order from a pharmacy for iron drops and the gentle vitamins they give to women who are expecting. Verity closed the ledger then. She closed it very softly, the way you close a door on a sleeping child, and she sat in the silence of her office with her hand pressed flat against her own stomach, and she understood that she was going to go to the cannery district. She waited 2 more nights, because she needed to be sure, and being sure was the only religion she had ever kept. On the second night, the side door sounded again just after midnight, and this time Verity was ready. She had told the night guard she was going to see her sister across the city, which was a lie. So ordinary, no one questioned it, and she had her own small car waiting in the lower drive, with the lights off. When Emery's pulled the black car out through the gates, she let 3 other cars come between them, and then she followed, the way she had watched the family's own men follow Mark's 100 times, close enough to keep the taillights and far enough to be nobody. The rain came back as they dropped down out of the hills and into the low flat streets by the water, and Verity kept both hands tight on the wheel and told herself, over and over, that there would be an explanation. There was always an explanation. She was the woman who found the explanation. Perhaps he was hiding a witness. Perhaps it was a woman who owed the family a debt, or a woman the family owed. Perhaps the vitamins meant nothing, and she had built a monster out of a grocery list because she was frightened and pregnant and in love with a man who was marrying someone else. She held on to that. She held on to it the whole way down the hill, through the dead districts, past the shut cannery with its broken teeth of windows, until the black car ahead of her finally slowed and turned into a narrow lane between 2 brick buildings and stopped. Verity killed her engine half a street back and sat in the dark, in the rain, watching. And the reasonable voice in her head went quiet and did not come back. She watched Lazar get out of the car. She watched him look up and down the empty street, the way he always did, checking corners, without seeming to. And then she watched him do something she had never seen him do for anyone. She watched him take a key from his own pocket, his own key, and open a door himself, and go inside a building that appeared on no map she kept and in no book she balanced, in a part of the city where the Voss family did not exist. And she watched, through the ground floor window, where the curtains did not quite meet, a light come on in a warm room, and a shape rise from a chair to meet him, a woman's shape. And even from half a street away, even through the rain on the glass, Verity could see the low, round curve of the woman's belly, far heavier and far further along than her own. And she watched Lazar Voss cross that warm room and put both his hands upon it as gently as a man handling something holy. The rain came down. Verity did not move, and the small, hard fact against her own ribs turned over. Once, like something waking up, she sat in the car for a long time, after the light in the window went out, though it did not go out, not really. It only moved. She watched it travel from the front room to a room deeper in the house, a softer light, a bedroom light, and she watched it settle there and stay. Her hands had gone cold on the wheel. She could not feel her fingers. Somewhere very far away, a foghorn called out over the water and was answered by nothing. She should leave. She knew that. Every scrap of sense she had, and she had a great deal of sense, was telling her to turn the key and drive back up the hill and lock her office door and decide, in the clean light of morning, what a woman in her position was going to do. But sense was a thing she used on other people's problems. She sat there in the dark with the rain hammering the roof, and she found that she could not make her hand move to the key, because the moment she drove away, this would become real. And a small mad part of her still believed that if she simply stayed here long enough, watching, It did not change. She got out of the car. She did not decide to. Her body simply did it. The door opening, the rain closing over her, the cold soaking instantly through her coat and her hair. She crossed the empty street with her heart slamming against her ribs and the baby, and she was halfway across the open ground when a small orange point of light flared in the dark by the black car, and she stopped as though she had walked into glass. Emery's was still there. He had not gone inside. He was leaning against the front of the car, with his collar up against the rain, and he had lit a cigarette, and the little coal of it swung as he lifted it to his mouth. If he turned his head, he would see her standing in the middle of the street like a fool, a woman from the hill in the wrong part of the city at the wrong hour. And Verity did not let herself finish. The thought of what came after that, of the questions, of how a man like Emrys reported the things he saw, of what it would mean for her, and for the small, hard fact against her ribs, to be found spying on the head of the family at his most hidden door. She moved. She did not run, because running catches the eye. She simply flowed sideways into the deeper black of a shut doorway and pressed her spine to the door and made herself into a shape the dark already owned, and she stood there, with the rain filling her collar and her own pulse loud as a fist on a table. Emery smoked. He looked up and down the street once, slow, the way the family taught its men to look, and his gaze passed across the doorway where she stood and did not stop, and Verity did not breathe until it had moved on. He finished the cigarette. He crushed it under his heel and got back into the car, and pulled the door shut, and through the fogged windshield she saw the pale glow of a screen as he bent to it, gone to the small private business of a man told to wait outside. Only then did Verity let the air out of her lungs in one long silent ribbon, and only then did she cross the last of the open ground, keeping to the wall, and press herself into the shadow beside the ground floor window where the curtains did not meet, and look, because she was above and below everything else, a woman who looked. The front room was warmer than any room in the whole cold mansion on the hill. That was the first thing that broke her. There was a worn, soft couch, and a lamp with a shade the color of honey, and there were things scattered about that spoke of an ordinary life being lived in an extraordinary hiding place. A folded blanket, a paperback left face down on the arm of the couch, a pair of slippers by the couch, and beside them, so small and so devastating that Verity's breath left her entirely, a pair of tiny knitted booties, half finished, the needles still in them, the wool, the pale yellow of butter. And then Lazar came back into the room, and Verity forgot how to breathe for an entirely different reason. He had taken off his coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, which she had almost never seen outside the private hours that belonged to her, and he was carrying a tray with 2 cups on it. And he set it down on the low table with a care she recognized, a care she had thought, God help her, was hers. The woman came in behind him. She was young, younger than Verity, with dark hair loose around a soft, tired face, and she moved with the careful, heavy grace of a woman near her time, one hand always resting on the great curve of herself. She lowered onto the couch, and Lazar knelt in front of her. Actually knelt, on the floor, this man who did not kneel to anyone, and he said something Verity could not hear, and the woman laughed and put her hand in his dark hair for a moment. And Verity watched the most dangerous man she had ever known close his eyes and lean his forehead against the swell of another woman's belly as though he were praying. The cup slipped in Verity's fingers. She did not remember picking anything up. It was only the rain on her own hand, cold, running down her wrist. Inside, she saw Lazar lift his head and speak, and this time the window carried a few words of it out into the wet, dark, low and rough and unbearably tender, and the words she caught were, "No one is going to take him from us. I swear it on my blood. No one." And the woman nodded and pressed her lips together against tears, and put both her hands over his, where they lay on the front of her. Verity turned and walked back across the street in the rain. She did not run at first. She walked, upright, the way she had trained herself to walk out of every room that had ever tried to break her. She got into her car, and she put the key in, and her hand was shaking so hard it took 3 tries. And only when the engine finally caught did the sound tear out of her, one short, ugly, broken sound, before she pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and drove. She did not remember the drive home. She remembered pieces of it. The smear of red lights, the wipers, her own eyes in the mirror looking like a stranger's. She remembered thinking, with the cold, flat clarity that was the only tool she had ever truly owned, that it made a horrible kind of sense. Of course, he had another life. Of course the great and terrible Lazar Voss, who was marrying Coralie Renard for the ports and keeping Verity for the nights, had a third door somewhere, a warm one, with knitted booties in it, for the woman and the child he actually wanted. She had been so proud of being the one who knew everything. She had built her whole life on knowing everything, and she had not known this. She had planned his wedding to one woman, while carrying his child, and never once suspected there was a second woman he had already chosen, over them both. By the time the gates of the estate closed behind her, she had stopped crying, and that was somehow worse. Because when Verity stopped feeling a thing, it did not mean the thing was gone. It meant she had filed it away somewhere she could take it back out later and use it. She sat in the dark of the lower drive, with the rain drumming on the roof, and both hands pressed flat and cold against the place where their child was, and she made herself a promise in a voice she did not recognize as her own. She was going to find out everything, and then she was going to decide what it was worth. The next morning, she was at her desk by 7, as she always was, in a charcoal dress, with her hair pinned back so tightly it ached, and when Lazar came down at 8:30 with 2 fingers pressed absently to the inside of his own wrist, she smiled at him, the way she smiled at the accountants from the north, smooth all the way down, no seams. Something was wrong with her, and Lazar felt it before he could name it, and that was the crack she had not planned for. He stopped in the doorway of her office, with his coffee in his hand, and he looked at her for a moment too long. He was a man who read rooms for a living, who had stayed alive into his 34th year in a business that killed most men younger by noticing the exact things other people worked hard not to show. She had forgotten that. In her grief, she had forgotten that the same stillness that had frightened her 7 years ago was also a kind of attention, and that she had spent 7 years teaching him how to read her in particular. "You are angry with me," he said. It was not a question. He never asked questions he already knew the answers to. "I have 400 guest confirmations and a florist who is threatening to quit," Verity said, without looking up from the page. "I do not have the time to be angry." "That is not a no," Lazar said. She looked up then, because not looking up had become its own kind of confession, and she gave him the flat professional face she gave the world, and she said, "Is there something you need, or is this about the seating chart?" And she watched something move behind his eyes, something that might in another man have been guilt, and might in this one have been calculation, and she could not tell which, and the not being able to tell was the loneliest thing she had ever felt. He set his coffee down on the corner of her desk. He did not do that. He was a man who respected the borders of her desk the way other men respected borders between nations. And now he set his cup down inside her country, and he leaned his weight on his knuckles, and he looked at her, close, and said in the low voice that belonged to the private hours, "Verity, what is it? You have not looked at me properly in 2 days. I know your faces. This is not one of them." And she almost told him that was the thing she would think about later, lying awake. In that one moment, with him close enough that she could smell the rain still on his collar and the particular warmth of him underneath it, she almost put her hand over his on the desk and said, "I followed you to the cannery. I saw her. I saw the booties. I am carrying your child, and I have been planning your wedding, and I want to know how you could do this." The truth was right there, filling her whole mouth. But she was Verity, who never let a number lie, and who also never ever showed her hand before she had counted the whole table. So she swallowed it. She smiled her smooth smile, and she picked up her pen, and she said, I am tired. That is all. Weddings are exhausting, especially other people's. And she watched him hear the small blade hidden in that last sentence, watched him not quite understand it, watched him straighten up slowly, and pick his coffee back off her desk and study her one more moment. Then, get some rest, he said quietly. I need you sharp. And he left. And she sat, looking at the ring his coffee cup had left on the wood of her desk, a small wet circle where a border had been crossed. And she thought, no, you do not get to need me sharp. Not anymore. The sickness came for her the next morning, as it had been coming for a week now, without mercy and without warning, and it chose the worst possible moment to arrive. She was standing in the long gallery with Emrys, going over the movements of the guard for the wedding, a list she had built and now hated, when the smell of the lilies the florist had left in the hall reached her and turned the whole world liquid. It rose up her throat so fast, she had no time to be clever about it. She set her hand flat against the cold plaster of the wall and breathed through her nose and said, in a voice she fought to keep level, Excuse me, the smell of those flowers, they have overdone it. Emrys looked at her. He was not a stupid man. He was in fact the least stupid man in the house, after Lazar, and Verity watched him take in the sudden gray of her face and the sweat at her hairline and the way her hand had gone to the wall, and she watched a small question form behind his closed fist of a face. You have been unwell, he said. It was not a question either. They did not ask questions in this house. Bad fish, Verity said, from the market. It will pass. Emrys said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You should tell the doctor to look at you. And there was something in the flat way he said it, something almost gentle, that frightened her far more than suspicion would have. Because it was not suspicion, it was the beginning of concern. And concern in a man like Emrys had a way of becoming loyalty pointed in a direction she could not control. She thanked him, she said she would. She walked out of the gallery with her spine straight, and her stomach in revolt, and she made it to the small washroom off the kitchen before she was sick, quietly, with the tap running to cover the sound, and when she straightened up and looked at herself in the spotted mirror, she saw a woman with two secrets now instead of one. And no safe place to set either of them down. She rinsed her mouth. She fixed her hair. And then, because there was nothing else in the whole world she knew how to do with fear, except turn it into work, she began that day. She was patient. She had always been patient, but now she was patient, the way a knife is patient in a drawer. She pulled the deed records for the cannery district through a clerk who owed her a favor and did not ask why. She traced the grocery payments back through 3 shell accounts, all of them her own creations, all of them turned against their maker. She learned that the warm little house had been quietly bought 8 months ago, through a company that existed only on paper, a company whose paper she herself had once filed without ever reading what it was for, because Lazar had handed it to her across the desk one ordinary afternoon and said only, "Bury this one deep," and she had trusted him. And buried it. She had to go into the deep files to be certain, and the deep files were not hers. They lived in Lazar's own study, in a cabinet behind the false back of a bookshelf, and only 3 people, in the world, had ever been shown the trick of opening it. Verity was one of them, because Verity was the memory of the Empire, and a memory must be allowed into every room. But being allowed into a room and having any innocent reason to be there at midnight were 2 different things. And so she waited until Lazar took his late meeting at the docks and Emrys drove him, and she let herself into the dark study, with her heart going like a trapped thing, and she opened the cabinet and she read. She was still reading when she heard the car in the drive. It came far too early. The meeting should have run past 1 in the morning. She had built the schedule herself, and instead here were headlights sweeping across the study ceiling at 11:30 and the sound of 2 doors, and Lazar's voice, low and Emrys answering. Verity did not panic. She had trained the panic out of herself years ago, or she had trained herself to keep working while it screamed, which came to the same thing. She slid the file back into its exact place. She pressed the false back until it clicked. She turned the shelf true. She was 3 steps from the study door, with a story already built in her mouth. Something about the seating chart, something about needing his signature, when the door opened and Lazar was standing in it, close enough to touch, his coat still on, the cold of the outside still coming off him. For a moment neither of them moved. "You are working late," he said. His eyes went past her, once, to the room, to the shelf, to the desk, the fast, complete sweep of a man who could not stop reading a space even in his own house. And Verity made herself hold perfectly still and let him look, because a guilty woman fills a silence and an innocent one lets it lie there. "I could not sleep," she said. "The florist. I came to leave the revised chart on your desk so you would see it in the morning." And she lifted the folder she had, thank God, thought to bring as a shield, and she set it on the corner of his desk, in the light, in plain sight, and she watched him look at it and look at her and slowly, slowly, decide. "You look pale," he said at last, and the danger in the room turned into something worse, into the low private voice from the wine cellar, from the nights, from the life she was in the middle of losing. He reached out and he almost touched her face, his hand rising the way it had risen 100 times in the dark. And she stepped back before it landed. One clean step, and she saw the small flinch of it go through him, saw him register that she had pulled away from a hand she had never once pulled away from. And she watched him file that fact, somewhere behind his eyes, the same way she filed everything. "Good night, Lazar," she said, and she walked out past him, close enough to feel the rain still on him, and she did not let herself run until the door of her own room was shut and locked behind her, and her back was against it and her hand was pressed hard over the place where their child was. She had gotten what she came for, she had read enough, and what she had read had turned the whole cold shape of the thing over in her hands. 8 months. She sat with that number for a long time. The woman in the house was near her time now, heavily pregnant, and far along, which meant she had come into Lazar's life, or at least into that house, months before Verity had ever pressed her fingers to his wrist in the wine cellar. The math of it laid itself out in front of her, with the awful neatness of all true math. He had not betrayed her with this woman, he had been keeping this woman before there was any her to betray. Which meant Verity had walked into something already built, already hidden, already sworn upon his blood, and had mistaken her small corner of his life for the whole house. That should have hurt less, it hurt more. But there was something in the numbers that did not sit right, and Verity had spent her whole life listening for exactly that feeling, the small wrongness in a column that balances too easily. 8 months ago, she went and pulled the old files, the family files, the ones written in the careful shorthand the syndicate used for its own dead, and she found the date she was half looking for and half praying she would not. And when she found it, the whole cold shape of the thing shifted under her hands and became something else entirely. 8 months ago, Lazar's younger brother had been buried. His name had been Dominic, and Verity had known him a little. A warmer and more reckless copy of Lazar, quick to laugh, quicker to anger, the kind of man who was loved precisely because he was not built to survive. The family had put out that he died in a car accident on the coast road, and the family had grieved, and Lazar had stood at the grave in the rain and pressed 2 fingers to his own wrist and said nothing at all. And Verity had stood against the far wall as she always did and watched him not weep. She had assumed, as everyone assumed, that Domit had died as he had lived. Too fast on a wet road. She had never once been given a reason to count that number twice. She counted it twice, now. 8 months ago Dominic Foss went into the ground. 8 months ago a paper company bought a warm little house in a district the family had abandoned. And in that house, this week, a woman near her time was knitting yellow booties, while the head of the Voss family knelt at her feet and swore on his blood that no one would take the child from them. She thought about the funeral. She made herself go back to it, that gray afternoon, 8 months ago, and she looked at it now with the harder eyes she had grown, since there had been no open casket. The family had said it was because of the accident, because of what a coast road does to a car and a man, and no one had questioned it, because you do not ask to see the ruin of a body you loved. But Verity had arranged that funeral too, the way she arranged everything, and she remembered now a small thing she had filed away and never read, the way she had filed the paper for the cannery house. She remembered that the death certificate had come from a doctor who was not the family doctor, signed in a town 200 miles up the coast, in a place the Voss family had no reason to be. She had noticed it at the time the way you notice a single wrong note in a song you are not really listening to, and she had let it go, because Lazar had handed her the paper across the desk that day too, and said only, "File this, and do not make copies." She had spent 8 months believing Dominic Voss died on a wet road, because a piece of paper told her so, and the man she loved asked her not to look at it twice. Verity sat back in her chair very slowly, her hand drifting to her own stomach without her permission, and for the first time since the rain and the window and the tiny half-finished booties, the pain in her chest made room, just slightly, for something colder and sharper and far more dangerous. Because, if Dominic had not died the way the paper said, then the woman in the warm little house was not a widow being hidden out of grief. She was a widow being hidden out of fear. And the child she carried, a child who would carry the Voss blood and the Voss name and, if it were a son, the Voss claim, was not a secret Lazar was keeping for love. It was a secret he was keeping alive. She had been asking the wrong question. She had spent 2 days breaking her own heart over whose bed the woman shared. And the whole time the real question had been sitting in the books she thought she knew, patient as a knife in a drawer. Not whose bed, whose child, and not who the woman had loved, but who wanted her buried beside the husband they had already put in the ground. Lazar had sworn on his blood that no one would take the boy from them, and a man does not make that oath against a danger that is not real. And men do not hide the widows of accidents in abandoned districts and buy their groceries through 3 false companies and sign their brothers' death certificates in towns they have never been to. Someone had killed Dominic Voss. Someone had made it look like a road. And that someone was still out there, still patient, still counting, and now there was a second child coming, an heir the family did not know existed, in a house Verity had helped hide without ever knowing she was doing it. She thought of Coralie Renard in the good chair, asking in her light bored voice whether Verity had any secrets. She thought of Silas Renard, who did not tolerate loose ends, whose ports the whole alliance was built to buy, who was flying in for a wedding in 9 days. She thought of Lazar agreeing to that marriage with a single nod while a dead man's widow knitted yellow booties in the dark. And Verity, who never let a number lie, sat alone in her locked room, with one hand pressed over her own unborn child, and understood, at last, that she had not stumbled onto a betrayal. She had stumbled onto a war that had already claimed one Voss brother, that was circling a second Voss child in an abandoned house by the water, and that was walking up the front steps of this very estate in 9 days wearing a wedding dress with the thorns stripped off by hand. She did not yet know who had started it, but she was going to. She was going to open every book in this house until the lie showed its face, even if the face that showed was the one she had pressed her fingers to in a wine cellar and loved ever since. She reached for her pen. Her hand had stopped shaking, and that she knew was the most dangerous thing of all. She went back to the cannery house 3 nights later, and this time she did not hide in a doorway across the street. This time she walked up to the warm door with the key trick she had watched Lazar use, though she did not have the key, and she knocked, softly, the way the delivery men must knock, twice and then once, because she had read the pattern in the grocery invoices without ever knowing she was memorizing a way in. The door opened on a chain. One dark eye and a slice of a soft, frightened face looked out at her through the gap. And Verity looked back and said the only thing she had that might buy her a single minute. "I know about the booties," she said. "The yellow ones. I know Lazar buys the iron drops through the fish account. I am not here to hurt you. I am here because I think someone is going to." The eye went wide. The chain did not come off. But it did not shut either. And in that held breath, Verity understood that she had guessed right about the fear. And that fear, in the end, is a kind of lock that opens from the inside when a person has been holding it alone for too long. Her name was Neve. She said it the way you set down something heavy. She let Verity in because she was 7 days from her time, and terrified, and had spoken to no one but Lazar and a quiet doctor named Sabin for 8 months, and because Verity had the one quality that made frightened people trust her against all sense, which was that she listened as though every word were a number she refused to let lie. They sat in the warm front room with the honey lamp between them, and the half-finished booties on the arm of the couch, and Neve wrapped both hands around a cup of ginger tea and told her. Dominic had not died on the coast road. Dominic had been run off it, on purpose, by 2 cars that boxed him in the dark, and he had lived for 6 hours in a room above a garage 200 miles north, while a doctor who had been paid not to save him pretended to try. Neve had been there. Neviv had held his hand while he bled, and while he told her, over and over in the small time he had left, that he had found something in the family's accounts. A door that led somewhere it should not. Money going north to the Renards a full year before anyone spoke the word alliance. He had gone to confront the man who kept those books beside the true books, and that man had smiled at him, and 11 days later 2 cars had come out of the dark. Dominic died believing he had killed them both by being right out loud. He begged Neva to disappear. He begged her to protect the child. She was only just beginning to carry. Because a dead man's son is either the future of a family or the loose end that ends it, and there is no third road. She had run to the only person Dominic trusted. She had run to Lazar. And Lazar had hidden her, and grieved his brother in public as an accident, because the moment he called it murder, he would have to name the murderer, and he did not yet have the proof to survive naming him. And a Voss who accuses the family's own blood without proof does not live to see the trial. So he had waited. He had buried Dominic under a lie. He asked his own memory to file without copies. He had bought a warm house in a dead district, and filled it with ginger tea and iron drops and a doctor sworn to silence, and he had knelt at the feet of his brother's widow and sworn on his blood that the child would live, and then he had gone home and agreed to marry into the very family the money ran toward. Because the surest way to find the door Dominic died over was to walk through the front of the house that built it. Verity sat very still, while the whole shape of it turned over and became at last something she could hold. He had not betrayed her. He had been carrying a murdered brother and a hidden widow and an unborn heir, and a war he could not yet declare. All of it, alone, all of it silent, and he had not told her because she was the memory of the Empire, and the Empire was exactly the thing trying to kill them. He had kept her out to keep her clean. He had kept her out to keep her alive. And she had followed him through the rain, and called it betrayal, because it was easier to believe a man had a second woman than to believe he had a second grave. The door opened behind her while she was still holding the cup. Lazar stood in it with the rain on his shoulders, and his key in his hand, and a stillness in him she had never once seen cracking now, all the way down, as he looked at the 2 women sitting in the honey light with the booties between them. He did not shout. He was a man who had spent his whole life not shouting. He only looked at Verity for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice worn down to the wood, "How long have you known?" "Long enough to be ashamed of what I thought," Verity said. And Lazar closed his eyes, this man who did not close his eyes in a room he had not cleared, and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his own wrist, feeling for the pulse, for the proof that he was still a living man. And Verity crossed the small warm room and put her fingers over his instead, and felt his heart going hard and fast, and frightened under her hand, and understood that the most dangerous man she had ever known had been drowning quietly in front of her for 8 months, and she had been too busy planning his wedding to see him go under. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been doing the same thing to you." And she almost told him then. The words rose the way they had risen a month ago, with his hands spread open on her stomach. But Nev was watching them with her hands folded over her own great burden and her eyes full, and it was not the moment, and Verity had spent her whole life knowing which moment was not the one. So she held it one more time, and she said instead, the thing that was truer than any confession, the thing that was hers to give. Dominic told her about a door, Verity said. Money going north, a year before the alliance. A second set of books kept beside the true ones. She looked at Lazar, and the cold, clear part of her that never slept was already awake and already counting. "I am the only person alive who has read every book in that house. If there is a second set, I have touched it without knowing what it was. Give me 2 days. I will find the door your brother died walking through, and I will find the name at the end of it, and this time we will have the proof." Lazar looked at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope. And behind them, so soft, they almost missed it, Neva made a small sound and pressed her hand hard against the side of her belly, and her face went white, and she said, in a voice gone thin with fear, "I think something is wrong. I think it is too early." And the room that had finally filled with truth, filled just as fast, with a new and far more urgent kind of dread. Nev did not deliver that night. Dr. Sabin came within the hour, a lean old man, with cold hands and a warm voice, and he pressed and listened and counted and finally sat back and said it was not labor, not yet, only the body rehearsing, only fear wearing itself out through the muscle, and that Neve had perhaps a week, maybe less, and that she needed calm and rest, and above all, not to be moved. He said, the last part, looking at Lazar, because moving her was exactly the thing that fear was going to demand of all of them. And a doctor, who had kept a secret for 8 months, knew how these stories usually went. Verity used the time the way she used all time, which was completely. She went home to the estate before dawn, and she did not sleep, and she opened every book in the house. Not the household ledgers this time, the deep ones, the ones written in the family shorthand for money that did not officially exist, the arteries of the empire. She had built half of them herself. She knew their rhythms, the way a mother knows a child's breathing in the dark, and so she was listening, from the first page, for the one breath that came a beat too easy. She found it on the second night, at 3 in the morning, in a column so clean and so well kept that it had never once asked her to look at it twice. There was a maintenance account. Every family had one. Money for the boring immortal costs of a criminal enterprise, the bribes and the repairs and the quiet retainers. And this one had been running smooth and reasonable for years under the signature of the man who had taught Lazar to read a room and shoot a gun and bury a brother. The family's oldest hand, Lazar's uncle, Anselm Voss. Verity had reconciled this account 100 times and blessed it for its tidiness. Tidiness was the tell. She saw it now with eyes that had been to a warm house by the water. The maintenance account paid a retainer, small, monthly, faithful as a heartbeat, to a medical practice 200 miles north. The same practice, the same town, the same doctor, a man named Vaughn, who had signed a death certificate for Dominic Voss in a place the family had no reason to be, and who had been on Anselm's private payroll for 3 years before Dominic ever died. And the maintenance account had a second habit. Once a quarter, it moved a larger sum, always rounded, always through a shipping company that Verity herself had incorporated on an ordinary afternoon when Lazar handed her a paper and said, "Bury this deep." She had assumed it was Lazar's. She pulled the incorporation now and read it properly for the first time in her life, every line, the way she should have read it then, and she found at the very bottom, in the place no one ever reads, the name of the true owner behind the paper, and it was not Voss at all. It was a holding company in the north. It was Renard, Anselm had been selling the family to Silas Reynard for years. He had used Verity's own clean hands to build the pipe the money flowed through. Dominic had found it and died for it. And the alliance, the wedding, the 600 chairs, and the roses, with the thorns stripped by hand, was not a merger and had never been a merger. It was the last payment. It was the day the Voss family walked willingly into the Renard house and closed the door behind itself, and Anselm, the loyal old uncle, would stand in the receiving line and smile, having sold his own nephews for a seat at a larger table. The only thing standing between Silas Renard and a clean, quiet takeover was a widow in a house by the water, and the child in her, the one Voss whose claim came before the wedding could erase it. Verity understood, then, with the awful neatness of all true math, why the strike had to come before the vows and not after. A married Lazar was a Renard problem to manage. An unmarried Lazar with a hidden heir was a fire to put out fast. The wedding was 2 days away, which meant they were not going to wait for it. She was still sitting with that certainty, cold to the bone, when her own body betrayed her at last. The sickness rose without warning, the way it always did, and she barely reached the basin. And when she straightened up, gray and shaking, she turned and found Lazar standing in the doorway of her office, because of course he was, because he had come down before dawn looking for her the way he always did. He did not ask if she was ill. He was a man who read rooms for a living, and he had spent 7 years learning to read her in particular, and Verity watched him look at the basin and the hour and the gray of her face and the hand she had pressed, without meaning to, flat against her own stomach. And she watched him arrive at the truth. She had been holding behind a wall for 11 days, and then 5 days more, watched it land in him like a struck bell. He crossed the room. He did not speak. He knelt, this man who did not kneel the way he had knelt at Nev's feet, and he pressed 2 fingers to the inside of Verity's wrist, feeling for her pulse, and then he moved his hand and spread it open flat and warm over the place where their child was, and he looked up at her with everything in him unlocked at once. In the low, ruined, private voice, "How long?" 18 days now, Verity said. "I have known since before I ever followed you, since before any of this. I was going to tell you after the wedding. I thought I was keeping us safe." "We are a family of people," Lazar said, almost laughing, almost weeping, "who nearly died protecting each other from the truth." And he pressed his forehead to her stomach the way he had pressed it to his brother's widow. And Verity put both her hands in his dark hair, and for one moment, in the cold gray office before the last terrible days, there was nothing between them but the 2 heartbeats under his hand and the one under her own. Then she told him about Anselm, and the softness went out of him like heat out of a room, and what was left standing when she finished was not the man who had knelt on her floor, it was the other one, the still one, the one who waited in silence until the frightened confessed. "He is going to move on Nev before the wedding," Verity said. "Dr. Sabin says she cannot be moved. And I have found the proof, all of it, the doctor, the shipping company, the name at the end of the door. But proof is only worth something if we live to show it to the family. And Anselm has had 8 months and every advantage, and he does not know we know." She stopped. She made herself say the last true thing, the one that frightened her most. "That is our only weapon. He does not know that we know. The moment he learns it, the 6 hours he gave your brother is the mercy we should expect." Lazar stood in the gray light, with his brother's murder finally wearing a face, and he pressed 2 fingers to his own wrist one last time, and then he let his hand fall, calm. At last, terribly calm. "Then we do not let him learn it," he said. "We let him keep his own wedding." And he told her the shape of the thing he meant to do, and it was cold, and it was patient, and it was the most Voss thing she had ever heard, and Verity, who had spent her whole life refusing to let a number lie, sat down across from the father of her child and helped him build the one beautiful lie that might keep all 4 of them breathing. They did not warn the family. They did not move the widow. They let the maintenance account run smooth. And they let the roses arrive. And they let Anselm believe that his oldest and cleanest instrument, the careful woman who kept the books, still balanced them for the family, and not against it. Verity went to Anselm herself, 2 days before the wedding, with a folder of harmless things and a smooth, unseamed face, and she asked his advice on the seating of the northern cousins, and she watched the old man pat her hand and call her a treasure, and tell her the family would be lost without her, and she smiled and thanked him and thought, "You signed my brother-in-law's death in a town you have never been to." And she filed the warmth of his hand away in the place where she kept things she would take back out and use. The move came the night before the wedding, exactly as the math said it would. They knew it would be the house by the water, because the house by the water was the only loose end left, and they knew Anselm would not come himself, because men like Anselm never came themselves, and they knew he would use the family's own men, told some clean story about a threat, so that Vosguns would do Renard work and never know it. What Anselm did not know was that the careful woman who kept the books had spent 2 days quietly reading which men had taken his money and which had not, and that the loyal driver with the face like a closed fist had spent his whole life waiting to be asked to choose, and that when the cars finally rolled down into the dead district with their headlights cut, the warm little house was not holding a frightened widow alone in the dark. It was holding Verity and Nev and Dr. Sabin and Emrys, and behind them, waiting in the black, every man in the family who had ever refused Anselm's money and been quietly counted for it. And it was holding Lazar, who had gone to his brother's grave that morning and poured nothing on it and made no oath, because the time for oaths was over, and the time for the still man had come. They waited a long time in the dark house before the cars came, and it was the waiting Verity would remember, not the violence. She sat on the floor of the front room, with her back against the couch, and Neve beside her, the two of them holding hands in the black, the way children hold hands in a storm, and Nev, who had held a dying husband and kept a 8-month silence and knitted yellow wool against a fear she could not name out loud, turned her head in the dark. "If it goes wrong, you run, you do not stay for me, you have your own to carry." And Verity, who had spent her whole life being the person who did not need protecting, who had lived in the shadow of a desk and called it safety, gripped the other woman's hand harder and whispered back, "No, we are the same math now." And she found that she meant it all the way down, that somewhere between the rain on the window and this dark floor, she had stopped being the careful woman who watched other people's lives balance, and become a woman with something of her own that she would set the whole world on fire to keep. Neve made a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and held on, and then, very far off, they heard the first car turn down into the dead district with its headlights cut. Verity was not locked in a room with a gun. She did not know how to fire. That was the thing she would remember. She was in the front room with the honey lamp turned off, and Neve's hand crushing hers in the dark, and when the first man came through the door he had been told would be unguarded, it was Verity who spoke. From the black, in the flat, clear voice she used on the accountants from the north, and said, and that was the signal. And the dark came alive. For one moment it went wrong. That was the thing no plan could account for. The moment in the middle of any true violence where the count comes up short and the whole night tips toward the worse ending. 2 more men came through the back than Verity's reading of Anselm's payroll had promised. 2 men she had not been able to buy or predict, and one of them reached the narrow hall to the bedroom where Nev should have been and where the noise of the fighting now told him she was. And for a heartbeat, there was nothing between that man and the widow and the child but a stretch of dark floor and a doctor with cold hands. Verity heard Sabin cry out. She was already moving. She did not think, because thinking was a thing that happened after. She simply put her own body into the mouth of that hall with both her arms spread wide against the frames, a small charcoal shape between the intruder and the last of Dominic, and she said in the flat, clear voice that had walked so many dangerous men through so many smooth lies, You do not get to the women, you will have to start with me. And the man hesitated. He hesitated for exactly the length of time it took Emrys to cross the room behind him, because a man who hesitates over a woman who will not move is a man who has already lost. And then the hall was safe, and Sabin's hands were on Nev. And Verity was still standing in the doorway with her arms spread and her heart going like a fist on a table, when the last sounds died and the house went still. It was fast, and it was ugly, and it was mercifully brief, the way the truest violence always is, nothing like the long, slow dread that had come before it. Emrys was a wall in the dark. The family men who had refused the money took back their house, room by room. Verity did not watch the worst of it. She had Nev half behind her, and her own child low and secret in her, and she had made herself a shape between the door and the two lives she would not let anyone reach, and when a hand did close on her arm in the confusion, the ones that had trimmed the yellow wool and the blow landed hard enough that the hand let go, and Emrys was there before the man could make a second choice. And then it was over, and the house was full of the harsh breathing of people who had lived. They took Anselm at the estate, not the docks, because Anselm was not a man who dirtied his hands at a warehouse. He was a man who waited at home in a good chair with a glass of something old, believing the phone would ring with clean news. It rang. It was Lazar. Verity stood beside him in the study, where the deep books lived, and she listened to the father of her child tell his uncle, in a voice with no anger left in it at all, only arithmetic, that the account was closed, that the doctor named Vaughn was already talking, that the shipping company had a name at the bottom of it, that the whole family had now read, and that Dominic Voss had lived for 6 hours and used every one of them to be right. There was a silence on the line, the length of a grave. You cannot prove, Anselm began, and Lazar said, she already has, and turned and looked at Verity, and Verity did not smile, because it was not a thing to smile at, but she held the old man's future in a leather folder against her chest, and she felt the small, hard fact turn over inside her, alive, and she understood that she had done the one thing she was made to do. She had refused to let the number lie. What happened to Anselm happened away from the house and away from Verity, and she did not ask for the details, because she had learned that there are books a person keeps and books a person is wise never to open. She knew only that the maintenance account was closed for good, and that a chair at the wedding sat empty, and that the family, gathered and grim and shown the proof by the quiet woman they had all underestimated, chose blood over the north, and turned as one animal towards Silas Renard. There was no wedding. Silas Renard learned it from Lazar in person, which was its own kind of message, because Lazar did not travel to deliver news he could send. He walked into the man's hotel the morning the vows were meant to happen, alone, but for Emrys, past guards who had been told very clearly by very frightened people not to raise a hand, and he set a single sheet of paper on the table in front of the patriarch of the northern coast. It was 1 page of Verity's work, the shipping company and the name at the bottom of it, and the retainer to a doctor named Vaughn, and it was enough, because a man like Silas Renard did not need the whole ledger. He needed only to understand that the whole ledger existed and that someone alive knew how to read it. You built your alliance on a man inside my house, Lazar said, without heat, in the voice that was only arithmetic now. He is gone. The pipe he built is closed. The ports stay in the north where they have always been, and you and I will never speak again. And that is the mercy. He gathered the paper back up, because you never leave the original. Verity had taught him that years ago, without either of them knowing what it would one day be for. Because the second thing anyone learns about how my brother died, Lazar finished, they will learn from a courtroom, and not from me. Silas Renard, who had spent a lifetime being the most dangerous man in every room he entered, looked at the quiet paper and the quiet man, and understood that he had lost to an accountant he had never bothered to learn the name of, and he said nothing at all, which was the only wise thing left to say. Coralie flew home in the dress she never wore, And Verity felt for the woman who had asked so lightly whether she had any secrets, something that was almost pity, because Coralie had been a piece on the board too, moved by the same old men, and the difference between them in the end was only that Verity had refused to stay where she was placed. Neva delivered 8 days later, in the warm house that was no longer a hiding place, but a home, with Dr. Sabin at one hand and Verity at the other, and the child was a boy, and he came into the world red and furious and entirely alive, the last thing Dominic ever made, and the first Voss in 2 generations to be born without a lie wrapped around him. They named him for his father. Lazar held his nephew in the honey light and pressed 2 fingers gently to the impossible small wrist, feeling for the pulse. And when he found it, he made a sound Verity had never heard him make. And she went and stood beside him with her own hand on her own growing certainty, and the 2 cousins, the born and the coming, were for a moment the whole of the future in one small room. She married Lazar in the spring, in the garden, with no 600 chairs and no quartet from the capital, and no roses with the thorns taken off, because Verity had come to believe a person should be allowed to keep her thorns. Neve stood up for her. The boy slept through the whole thing against Emeris's shoulder. And when it came time for the vow, Lazar did not swear on his blood, because he had learned what those oaths cost, and instead he took Verity's hand and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, in front of everyone, feeling for the pulse, claiming it, and he said only, "You never let a number lie. Do not start with me." And Verity, who had spent 7 years being the memory of an empire, and invisible in the only way that mattered, looked at the man who had knelt on her floor and understood that she was not the help, and had never been the help, and would never again live behind a curtain in anyone's house. She did not become his shadow. She became his ledger, the one true accounting of everything the family was and owed and would answer for, and no one in that house or any other ever again made the mistake of believing that the quiet woman who kept the books was the least dangerous person in the room. She was the one who had read the whole table before anyone knew the game had started. She was the one who had refused to look away. And the man who had built an empire on silence had learned at last that the most powerful thing a person can hold is not a gun or a port or a name, but the truth, kept faithfully, and spoken at exactly the right hour by someone who was never, ever wrong about the count. So that is what she saw through the gap in those curtains, and why she ran, and why running was the beginning and not the end. She had gone looking for a leak in the books and found a murdered brother, a hidden child, a war 8 months old, and the true measure of the man she loved. And she had balanced it, every last impossible column of it. Because that is what she did. That is what she had always done. She never once, in her whole life, let a number lie, and in the end, the number that mattered most was the smallest one of all, the one no larger than a lentil and heavier than the entire house, and she carried it home. If you followed Verity all the way down into the dark and back out again, if you felt your chest tighten when she pressed her fingers to his wrist in that cold gray office, then do the quiet woman a favor and let this channel know you were here. Tap the like, hit subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes the softest person in the room is never the weakest. Tell me down in the comments, what was the moment you realized he was not a traitor at all? Was it the booties, or was it the oath? I read every one, and I will see you in the next story.